Hey everyone, Matt Thomas here. Thanks for watching. So this is the recorded version of the workshop that I've been doing all week at the various sites. And this is the first workshop. It's about how the brain learns. And I think that, so teenage brains learn very consistently, unless there's a developmental issue. Adults' brains, we learn very consistently. There's a very consistent way that we learn, again, unless there's a developmental issue. And if we know how the brain learns, we can teach more efficiently, right? We can kind of teach to that. And this is going to tie in with the next workshop, which is how memories are made. We can, if we know how memories are made and understand how memories are made, we can maybe hack our students' brains to get them to remember what we want them to remember, right? So this is the first series, how the brain learns. And I'm going to do this, I'm going to use the movie The Happening as an analogy. So if you've ever seen The Happening, you know that it's a movie about trees communicating with each other in an attempt to kill all of humanity. So as ridiculous as that sounds, the movie's not too far off. Not the killing off of all humanity, but the way the fact that trees communicate with each other. And so it's called the Wood Wide Web. Yes, that's the real term that scientists have given it. You can Google it if you'd like. And so I'm going to use that as an analogy for how our brain learns. So if you're looking at the screen here, you can see how individual trees have their own root system. And even when the roots are not connected, the trees will still communicate with each other. They'll share knowledge, they'll warn other trees of things coming up, they'll give nutrients, etc., etc. If a new tree is sprouting, like the trees will kind of shelter it, shade it, etc. So, and they do it by using a fungi system, but honestly that doesn't help with my analogy, so I'm just going to leave that out. So if you can imagine, and though the tree roots is a good analogy, I like to think of more like tree branches. So if you're looking at the screen, you can see the picture I have here. I envision the brain like tree branches, a lot of tree branches. And each kind of set of branches, neural networks, are things that we've learned, experiences, memories we have, etc., etc. So each time we learn something new, each time we teach our students something, a little branch grows, right, in our brain. It's called a neural pathway. So again, go with my analogy here. Every time we learn something new, we get a little branch growing in our brain, a new neural pathway. Each time we teach our students something, they get a little branch growing neural pathway. Again, kind of go with my tree analogy here. And the way to get that branch to grow is to water it, right? Or in the case with teaching, when our students are learning something new and they're growing the little neural pathway, the way to keep it growing is to reinforce the learning. That's where I'm saying to water that branch, to reinforce the learning. Because what happens is if you don't water the branch, it's going to die. So if you don't reinforce the learning, if you don't reinforce what you've taught the student, it'll go away. The brain repurposes cells from memories that it just doesn't find relevant or important enough to remember. It's called synaptic pruning. Essentially, if you learn something, or if you teach your students something and they learn something, and we don't keep reinforcing that information, watering that branch, the brain will repurpose the cells. They'll say, well, what you learned isn't that important, so we're just going to forget it, repurpose the cells for something else. So essentially, reinforcing the learning kind of tricks the brain into thinking that the information is important enough to remember. So, going back to the tree analogy, right? We teach something to our students, something they've never learned before. They're growing a new neural pathway in their brain. They're growing a new tree branch. But watering isn't enough. So repeating the information isn't enough. Because how many times have we done vocabulary review with our students, and yet they still don't do as well as we hoped? Or we do math review and they still don't do as well as we hoped. So just repeating the information is not enough. There's something else we need to do. And you could argue it's the second most important step. It's connecting the info to something the students already know. So, how the brain strengthens knowledge. When you teach your students something, and they get that new neural pathway, so it's in their brain, right? They're growing that new tree branch, and you're repeating the information, so they can remember it. To really get them to remember it or to know it, we have to connect the information to something the students already know. Essentially, rooting the information, going back to my tree analogy, right? We have to get those roots embedded, right? So it's called synapse connections. Essentially, whenever we experience something, those experiences imprint in our brain, and they try to find other things that they can connect with. Because if they're not connected, our brain's going to forget the information, right? So if we just give random information to our students, hey guys, open chapter 4, I'm just going to read a bunch of stuff to you and hope you remember it, the brain will forget it. It just doesn't find it relevant. There's some neuroscience stuff on the screen if you want to read it. So what we need to do is, if we want our students to remember the information, we need to connect it with something else. We need to grow roots, right? Root it around other things that the students already know. So if you're looking at the screen, here's a picture of a neural network. So someone who had a baseline of knowledge of something. And then the second picture is 2 weeks after doing cognitive exercises, reviewing the stuff, expanding the knowledge of it. And then the third picture is 2 months after cognitive exercises, reviewing the stuff, adding on to it, etc. You can see how there's so many more neural pathways connected to it, and that neural network is growing there. So the main reason why our students don't remember things. 1, teachers don't repeat the information enough in a way that's purposeful. It's not just read and repeat, but their brain has to find the information purposeful. So teachers don't repeat the information enough, watering the tree branch. 2, the information isn't connected to something that they already know. So my best example, one of my favorite examples, is poetry. If your students are just not remembering figurative language, they're just not getting poetry the way you want them to get it, it's probably because it's not rooted in something that they already know. Teach poetry through music lyrics. Have them pick their favorite music lyrics. Teach poetry that way. Not for a day, for 2 weeks. Make it a big thing. Teach poetry all throughout the year, but always connect it back to what they know, which is music lyrics, right? Their favorite lyrics. If you're, say, a math teacher, now math teachers, I will tell you, as an English teacher, I would never tell you like, hey, you need to teach it this way because I'm not a math teacher, right? My wife's a math teacher. She's a middle school math teacher. I see what she goes through. I have nothing but respect for math teachers. So take my suggestions however you want to take them, right? But I imagine like if I were a math teacher and I'm trying to teach discounts or percentages probably, then maybe I say, okay, guys, you're going on a shopping trip today, and I'm going to give each of you $500 mythical dollars, and you have to search and find, how many clothes you can buy with that 500, but look at their regular price, look at their sale price, find the percentage of the discount off, and then we'll see who gets the most amount of clothing while having the best percentage of savings, or something like, I'm making this stuff up. Okay, it was something like that. And I have math links for those of math teachers that haven't seen the math videos that I've done. Why is math so difficult to learn? Best ways to teach math based on mathematicians. I've got those videos linked as well. So if teachers are not repeating the information enough, watering the tree branch, and the information they're teaching is not connected to something the students already know, rooting that information in their brain doesn't find the information relevant enough to remember. So as teachers, we really want to try to create a real life purpose with what we are teaching. I'll talk about that more later. But you see, not even that's enough. So I mentioned that rooting, connecting the information you teach to something the students already know, I would say is like the second most important thing. The most important thing in learning, what sparks, what introduces, what starts the learning process is curiosity. We need to ignite that learning experience, curiosity. So we are born being curious. It's the reason why babies put their hands on their mouth, right? It's the reason why babies get up and start walking. It's hopefully the reason why many of you are watching this video, because you're curious. Hey, what did he talk about? Or you're forced to watch this. And either way, thank you for watching it. But the key is curiosity is the first stage of learning. And we're born with that. So Dr. Joe Policino says that here's his 4 stages of successful learning. He uses the acronym A.G.E.S, right? We're all getting older, A.G.E.S. A, attention. We need to spark curiosity in our students, right? Social media knows that. We could take lessons from social media, right? Listen, like, how do you guys do it? How do you distract our students away from us? Curiosity. And then G, so A is attention, curiosity. G, generate a connection to what the students already know. So whatever we're teaching has to connect to what the students already know. Emotion. This I'm going to talk more about my how memories are made video. The next workshop, I should say. Emotion. E. Remember. We remember things that we're more emotionally attached to or connected with. I'm going to talk about memory markers in the next workshop, and how we can kind of use that knowledge to get the students to remember what we want them to remember. So emotion, and then S. Spacing. We need to repeat and recall the information. Not memorizing vocab a few times before the test. I mean all throughout the year. We'll talk about that more on the how memories are made video. But if you remember, A.G.E.S. there. So how do we use this in class? We're teachers. So first step, we have to create curiosity. It's the first step of learning. And I've linked a video, Great Ways to Begin Class. I've linked my video there. You can click that and watch that video if you haven't already. Number 2, so once we create curiosity in class, and I'll talk about how to do that. Number 2, connect what you're teaching to what the students already know. So we have to establish that prior knowledge. The best way to create curiosity and connect to what the students already know is through the use of effective quick writes. I'm going to talk about that on this next slide. But once we create curiosity, once we connect what we're teaching to what the students already know, then we can connect what we're teaching to real world issues. And I always say teach what we know as teachers. So if you're a teacher and you had another career before becoming a teacher, like teaching is your second or third career, like I used to own a business before becoming a high school teacher. So in my class, I bring what I know. I talk about business stuff with them, right? I talk about close reading and how it's important in documents, in terms, and like the terms part of a contract. That's real world stuff. I'll talk about when I do argumentative writing. I'll talk about how to influence people with the words you use, all that stuff, because that's from the real world. And sometimes people will think like, look, those students will ask, when are we going to use this in the real world? I have an answer for everything I teach. And I think it's important that we do that as teachers. So if you had a career outside of the classroom before you were a teacher, use all that knowledge that you've learned, bring it into the classroom and connect it to your lessons somehow. So going back to creating curiosity and connecting to what students already know. Here's an effective way of doing quick writes, effective way of creating curiosity. I know a lot of teachers use quick writes. I know the textbook uses questions, but there's an effective way to do it. I call it give a story, take a story. So if we're going to ask our students to respond with personal information, it's very important that we as the teachers give personal information as well. So if I were doing, let's say I start Scarlet Letter, I start the class, I put a big T and tape it to my chest. And I start the class and everyone's like, dude, why are you wearing a T on your chest? I'm like, I'll explain. But then I start telling the story about the time when I was arrested for shoplifting when I was 14. And then I talk about how, like, what if I was still known for that one mistake I made? And that's what the T is for, thief. And then I ask, so I tell them a quick story and spark that curiosity. They're like, dude, you were arrested? Spark that curiosity. And then I ask them, when was a time like that you made it was like a major mistake that you made, or something that you are kind of embarrassed by you doing, that kind of thing. And we have that discussion. And then I start Scarlet Letter. If I'm doing autobiographical writing, like first person and third person perspective, etc., I tell them about the time I was jumped outside of Carl's Jr. By 3 guys because of who I was hanging out with. And then I tell them that story. It definitely sparks their interest. And then I ask them, like, hey, have you ever a time, tell a time where some people didn't like you because of who you hung out with, that kind of stuff. And then we get into autobiographical narrative writing, etc. Now, let me tell you what not to do. So if you're remembering the give a story, take a story, quick writes, remember the 2 to 3 minute rule. Don't tell a story that's longer than 2 to 3 minutes because your students are going to lose interest. Don't have them write for longer than 2 to 3 minutes. I'll tell you why. So I was at a conference about 10 years ago. Some of you may have actually been there with me. And this guy was talking about quick writes, and he tells this 10-minute story about how he's playing hide and seek with his daughter, but he can't find her. The story goes on for 10 minutes. He's like explaining everything in detail. And I didn't have a child at the time, so I was disconnected to the story. I had no interest or curiosity about it. The story went on for, no joke, 10 minutes, so most of the people the interest was lost. 2 to 3 minutes at the most, or you're going to start losing your students' interest. Then he had us write for 10 minutes. And with the writing process, when we're doing a quick write, the first 2 to 3 minutes are the most impactful, because after they think of the story, now they've got the bulk of it and they're writing all this stuff. After that, it's like 7 minutes of downtime. So I would highly suggest don't spend more than 2 to 3 minutes telling your story and 2 to 3 minutes having the students write. Then you can have the discussion. It's a great way to spark curiosity and to get them a personal connection to what they're doing. So here's our goals as teachers. Our goals as teachers are to A, create curiosity. It's the first step of learning. B, connect what we're teaching to what the students already know. C, connect what we're teaching to real world issues. How can you tie it into the real world so they can see something that's applicable to their life? And then D, repeat and recall that information, right? Continue to go over that information with the connection. And there's many different ways to do that. I'm going to talk more about that in my next workshop, how we remember things. So here's my example. If I'm teaching Romeo and Juliet, I will start with a story about Tim. Now, my students know about Tim. Tim's an idiot. He's made a lot of mistakes in his life. And so I'll be like, I'll start class. Literally, I'll be like, all right, guys, let me tell you about Tim. And they're like, ooh, we've heard about Tim, right? Spark curiosity. So I'll talk about how Tim was 14 years old. And he had some mental health issues that he completely made up. He lied to his mom about. And so he was put in a mental health hospital. And he was there for a while. There he met this girl. Fell in love with her. When he got out, he told his mom, like, I love this girl. And his mom's like, I forbid you to see that girl ever again. And he's like, oh, you forbid me? So he ran away from home, ran 6 miles to the mental health hospital, broke into the hospital, broke into her room, and stayed in her closet for 3 days while eating Jell-O. And I tell like the little bit longer, more interesting, more curious story during the class there. And then that's how I spark the curiosity there. And so then I asked them to make that personal connection. Please share a time when your parents forbade you, yes, that's a real word, to see someone or a family member or something like that. Like I'll rewrite my quick write questions 4 different ways or so. So every student will have something to share. Because the worst is when students are like, I don't have anything to share. If your quick write is too specific, like write it 3 or 4 different ways so everybody has a story that they can share, right? And so that creates that personal connection. Then I teach Romeo and Juliet. Only takes about a week for me to teach Romeo and Juliet because I'm really focusing more on the structure of a play. They all know the plot. So that's just how I teach it. You can teach it however you like, of course. There's many great ways to teach it. But then the way that I recall and repeat is I have them write and create and perform their own Shakespearean play in class. I get them into groups. They individually have to write and perform their own Shakespearean play in class. Where the recall and the repeat comes from is because during Romeo and Juliet, we would have gone over soliloquy, monologue, aside, stage directions, all that stuff. Now they're repeating it, recalling it, and applying it in their play. So that's one example of how I use that. So just to review, every time a person learns something, it creates a neural pathway, the tree branch, that tries to connect with other neural pathways to try to remember things. So when we share information, our students right away are getting that neural pathway and trying to figure out how to embed it in their memory. The information needs to be revisited or reinforced, watered, to stay in our memory. To help retain the information, it needs to be connected to something the students already know, so to root that information in. We need to have a real-world purpose or connection to what we're teaching so the students find it relevant. Use quick writes as a way to create curiosity, which is the most important step of learning. It's the first step of learning is curiosity. And finally, we want to make sure that we know our students can learn whatever we teach them, as long as we make it accessible or connected to what they already know. Don't think a text is too complex at all. We just have to find ways to connect it with students. If you saw my mathematician video, you know that 5-year-olds are learning algebra. They have the ability to learn algebra as long as we teach it in a way that connects to them. So as a final quick review, whenever we teach something new, it grows a new tree branch in our students' brains, a neural pathway. We got to keep watering that to keep it growing. We have to keep repeating the information. And connect what we teach to something that the students already know that roots it into our students' brains. And then we need to ignite that curiosity, most likely before we taught the information, ignite that curiosity, get the students curious, Part two of this is I'm going to talk about how memories are made. I'm going to share exactly how we remember things and why we remember things more than others. And if we know that, we can use that in our teaching to help our students remember what we want them to remember. Thanks for watching, guys.